Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be continuing our talk about the Wraithknight and how to fix it in 10th edition. So, contrary to popular belief, I actually think the Wraithknight is a decent unit in casual and semi-competitive games. A lot of people have shelved it for the most part, but truthfully, I think its only problem now is it's probably about 30 points too expensive, and, of course, that was because of the over-nerfing that GW laid upon it. And just for context, I was also upset when GW did the old triple nerf back in September when they, basically took the Wraithknight down, so to speak. And yeah, I didn't think they should have increased the points on it, obviously. And one of the main reasons for that was it invalidated many of the builds that people were using at that specific time in the meta. And people who were running different builds, like the Sword and Shield, were just not even able to run the Wraithknight in casual settings and still have a good time. It just wasn't a good model. So, having said that, even though there are builds that are still decent in semi-competitive and casual play with the Wraithknight, I think the Wraithknight deserves more than that. And I want to give you guys the solutions that I think will fix the Wraithknight in 10th edition. And hopefully when we get our new codex down the road, whenever that is, the Wraithknight will be fixed in that way. So in today's video, we're going to be discussing the problems with the current Wraithknight. We're going to be talking about possible solutions to the issues surrounding the Wraithknight and addressing, kind of community solutions that have come up so far. And then I'm going to talk about how I think the Wraithknight should actually be fixed with some examples. Okay, so what are the problems with the current Wraithknight? So first of all, the weapon options are not well balanced for the cost. And we all know this. This is something that is common knowledge, right? If you take a scatter shield and a sword, and you're paying 510 points for that, there's just no reason you shouldn't just take the Avatar of Cain, right? And even in some other cases, there's probably not much of a reason to take a Wraithknight over an Avatar anyway, unless you're running a certain type of build. So if you're running a melee-oriented build, there's just absolutely no reason to take it. Except, of course, for the rule of cool. The Wraithknight's ability does not have the best synergy as well with certain weapon and war gear combos. So -1 damage is really good, but in the current state of the game, when towering units can now hide behind ruins and obscuring terrain and stuff like that, having -1 damage on your profile really isn't that big of a deal when you can just fire and fade your Wraithknight back behind obscuring terrain. There's not much of an incentive for Wraithknights to really stick it into melee with a lot of units unless you're taking the Titanic Ghostglaive. And, again, that's invalidating a lot of the synergy between the ability and certain builds that you might be picking. And I think it goes without saying that the points cost is well over what it should be. And even if we did reduce the Wraithknight by about 30 points, which is what I think the best build on the Wraithknight should probably cost, the other weapon options that the Wraithknight can take would just still be really overpriced for the cost that you're paying, even at 480 if GW decided to buff the Wraithknight later on. Which is a huge shame because people should be able to play with whatever build they built their Wraithknight as and still have a decent chance of success with that unit if played correctly. Now, having said that, what are some of the possible solutions to the issues surrounding the Wraithknight that the community has come up with? And right off the bat, I think one of the better solutions that the community has come up with is swap the ability of the Wraithknight to something that can better accommodate all builds. Now, that is tough though, and I will say it's a good idea, right? But it's a little tough because it's tough to balance with the different weapons that the Wraithknight has. You have ranged weapons and also melee options with the Wraithknight. And what that often means is that you're going to be kind of split between wanting something that is good as a frontline model and wanting something that is good as a backline model that is going to be wanting to shoot at enemy units from afar. So that is a little bit tough to do. The other solution that the community has been speaking of, and this is probably the oldest solution that a lot of people have been talking about in 10th edition, is being able to add granular points back to the Wraithknight's options. Now, while I do agree that there probably could be a way to balance this out so that, every build is fairly effective points-wise, it doesn't really work with 10th edition rules and it would be hard to implement. And a lot of people pretty much already know this. This is really an 11th edition solution. We're not going to get something like this in 10th edition. So, it's kind of one of those pipe dreams. We're not going to get it for at least a couple years. And then even then, I don't think GW is going back to a point system. I think there's going to probably be something else, some sort of upgrade system that they add into the game. But I don't think we're going back to granular points anytime soon. And truthfully, speaking from experience, I have played other war games that do not also have the same kind of granular point system that GW has had for a long time. War Machine and Hordes did not have a granular point system, and all of their units were balanced accordingly, and it worked, right? The unit that you buy has certain options, and that's it. You can't really change them. You can add things on, you can upgrade the unit in certain ways by adding attachments. But for the most part, unless you were running a themed list or something like that, the costs were fixed. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. But having said that, there are going to be options that are clearly better than the rest in the current system. And I think that should be addressed in some way, shape, or form. And of course, the obvious solution to this is that if GW wants to continue their, kind of fixed point system, they have to create different data sheets for the Wraithknight, just like War Machine and Hordes, right? You had different units and they could come out of the same box, but you could give them different options, and those units had different points costs. This should be the same with the Wraithknight. You buy the Wraithknight kit and you can build one of several different data sheets. This is not only, I think, the best option, but it also has precedent in 10th edition with Crisis Battlesuits. They are a perfect example. They were a unit that had a lot of different options, and GW just decided to break them up into 3 separate data sheets. And I know a lot of casual Tau players were upset because they couldn't run their airburst fragmentation plasma rifle flamer build, but let's be honest here. Only you were running that, and you can also still run it as a Legends unit, right? There's still an option for that. And there could still be an option for a Legends style Wraithknight with all the different, kind of upgrades and options and stuff like that if you still want to run it in a weird, bizarre kind of way. But I just think that creating different data sheets for the Wraithknight that are more fixed would be a better solution without, having to over nerf a certain build or, overcompensate for another type of build and just have a wild west of points balance with this model. And it also kind of future-proofs the balance of the Wraithknight in the future. If for whatever reason there's an OP build that's out there, GW can focus on balancing that particular build and not, inadvertently nerf the other ones that people play. Okay, so here are the examples that I have for 4 different data sheets that the Wraithknight can have. And yes, I do think it should be 4. I know GW might come up with 3, but I realistically think that there are 4 that need to happen in order for everybody's build to still be viable and playable on the battlefield, no matter how you built your Wraithknight. Okay, so the 4 data sheets are as follows. We have the Juggernaut, which has the sword and shield, the Swashbuckler, which has the sword and gun, the Protector, which has the gun and shield, and you have the Bombadier, which has the dual guns. So I also decided, in addition to the new data sheets, that the Scatter Shield needed a glow up, because a 4+ invulnerable save is just not worth all the extra points that you would be paying for that upgrade, right? So, 4+ invul, it sounds nice on paper. When you get onto the battlefield, especially when you're in cover and things like that, it's just not that good. It's not going to give you much more of a save than you usually have already. So it needs something else as well. So in addition to the 4+ invul save, it now does the following. If you make a successful invulnerable save with your Wraithknight that has a scatter shield, you roll a d6. On the roll of a 1, nothing happens. On a 2 to a 5, the enemy unit that made the attack suffers d3 mortal wounds. On a 6, the enemy unit that made the attack suffers d6 mortal wounds. Now, a lot of you are going to be saying right now, and I know you're listening to this thinking, well, this is just totally OP. This is way too strong, stuff like that. But realistically, it's only on successful invulnerable saving throws. Most of the time, you're going to be using your armor against most light weapons, weapons that aren't going to have much AP. You're not going to want to just take extra wounds just to maybe deal d3 damage to that, enemy unit. There might be situations where you would want to, but you would be taking massive damage in return just to kill some infantry. So, there's going to be a lot of cases in which this isn't going to come up, but it is going to come up against, those attacks that you really want to take the scatter shield for, those high AP attacks, or those attacks that are going to ignore your armor save for the most part. This ability still does not work against things like devastating wounds. So, if you have a unit with dev wounds, it's still going to be very strong against this type of model. And I just think that in general, this better reflects the lore of the scatter shield and puts it in line with the other options. But definitely let me know what you guys think about the new scatter shield rule that I came up with in the comment section below. Is it too strong? Is it too OP? Or is it not OP enough? Okay, so the first datasheet we have is, of course, the Juggernaut. This is one of the coolest Wraithknight builds, the sword and shield variant. A lot of people went with this variant when they bought their first Wraithknight because it just looks really cool. It's armed with a Titanic Ghostglaive, a scatter shield, and either 2 scatter lasers, shuriken cannons, or star cannons. Those options are remaining. If you want to build them with, whatever secondary weapons you want, that's fine. Every Wraithknight is still going to be able to choose which secondary weapons they have. Its ability is basically the same as the current Wraithknight. Attacks against it are at -1 damage. Because this is the Juggernaut, it needs to be, forward deploying. It needs to be, kind of put into more risky positions. It needs to have some sort of damage debuff ability to keep it alive. So I think -1 damage is still a great ability to have on this model. And this model is going to clock in at 375 points, which may seem a little low to some of you guys out there, but keep in mind it doesn't have any powerful ranged weapons that deal devastating wounds and stuff like that. No heavy wraith cannon, no sun cannon. And this point cost was very similar to the original point cost of the Wraithknight. And a lot of people were saying back then that GW might have actually been looking at the sword and shield variant as a kind of baseline for their original Wraithknight cost. So I think 375 is around what this variant should be. All right, next up is the Swashbuckler, which is armed with the sword and gun, of course. So that means a Titanic Ghostglaive in one hand and either a sun cannon or heavy wraith cannon in the other. It is armed with either 2 shuriken cannons, 2 scatter lasers, or 2 star cannons, of course. And its ability is that all of its ranged weapons gain assault, and it is eligible to declare a charge in a turn which it advanced. So this Wraithknight is going to be a faster, more versatile, and more aggressive style of Wraithknight than the Juggernaut, but it doesn't have the same level of durability. It doesn't have -1 damage, and it does not have a 4+ invul save or the scatter shield ability. Instead, this thing is going to be looking at, picking off key targets, and essentially after that, if it's not well supported, it's going to probably die in short order. However, I do think that the cost of this should be higher because of the fact that it does have a ranged weapon that is very powerful. So we put this at 425 points. That's 50 points more than the Juggernaut, and I think that's just about right. Because truly, I do think that the heavy wraith cannon and sun cannon are worth about 50 points per gun. So this has one of them, so we're going to bump the cost up to 425 points. And I think that's pretty fair, considering this thing can basically kill 2 things a turn pretty easily, being able to advance and charge, and also, gaining assault weapons on its, either star cannons, shuriken cannon, scatter lasers, and the sun cannon or heavy wraith cannon. Okay, next up we have the Protector, which has the gun and shield. So this is armed with a scatter shield and either a sun cannon or heavy wraith cannon, and 2 scatter lasers, shuriken cannons, or star cannons. So just like the other variants, essentially, it can take whatever secondary weapon options it wants. As for its ability, once per turn, when an enemy unit targets a friendly Aeldari unit, excluding this model, so, basically excluding itself, within 12 inches of this unit with a ranged attack, after that unit has finished making its attacks, this unit can shoot as if it were your shooting phase. When doing so, it must target only that enemy unit and can only do so if that enemy unit is an eligible target. Now, that is a pretty powerful ability, I'm not going to lie, but just keep in mind also that the Protector can only use this ability once per turn, and it needs it to be at an eligible target. So if the Wraithknight cannot see that target, then it cannot obviously shoot it, right? If that target has lone operative, then you cannot shoot it, right? Or some other ability that prevents the Wraithknight from shooting it normally, then it's not going to be able to use this ability. So there's a lot of ways to get around it. The other thing is that if the Wraithknight itself is targeted, then you can't use this ability. It has to be a friendly unit within 12. So if an opponent really wanted to kill something and didn't want to be shot back, they could, of course, first kill the Wraithknight and then go to whatever target they needed to. That's going to be much harder to do because this is very, defensive with the scatter shield, but it is still very possible if the Eldar player does not position their Wraithknight in the correct way or positions it recklessly. And as for the points cost, I think this should be the same as the Swashbuckler at 425 points. It's subbing out the Titanic Ghostglaive for the Scatter Shield, which is, arguably a worse option, even with its ability. So, I do think it should be around 425 points. But let me know in the comment section if you think this should be more expensive or cheaper accordingly. Last up, we have the Bombadier. So the Bombadier is the, of course, broken variant that we had in the beginning of the edition with either 2 heavy Wraith Cannons or a heavy Wraith Cannon and a Sun Cannon. And of course, it can still take the same secondary weapon options, scatter lasers, shuriken cannons, or star cannons. But its ability is that its ranged weapons gain ignore, cover, and blast. If ranged weapons already have the blast keyword, just like, the heavy Wraith Cannon does, then you add 1 attack to its profile. This is a very powerful ability. Now you're able to ignore cover, which means things like pop smoke. And of course, other ways to get a cover save, like just being behind ruins, being in area terrain, or having some sort of ability or something like that, is going to be drastically reduced. And having blast, of course, makes the Sun Cannon, the Star Cannons hit much harder against infantry targets. The only weapon, of course, that doesn't directly benefit from blast is the heavy Wraith Cannon that already has blast. So I put a little caveat into the rule that if it already has blast, then you add +1 attack to its profile instead. So that's going to come in at 480 points because obviously this is a much more powerful shooting platform, has dual weapons, can fire a lot of shots from a safe range. You can always use fire and fade to go back into cover and stuff like that. So I think this should be more expensive. And yes, I do realize 480 points is a bit of a step up from the other 3 variants, but this is a much more powerful variant, especially when you combine the types of synergies that exist within the Eldar army. You could throw guide on this thing, which would make it even harder hitting. You could throw things like fire and fade on it so that it could, jump out of cover, hit something really hard, and then back out behind obscuring terrain. So I think this thing obviously should be more expensive as a result. And funnily enough, I originally had priced this thing at 520 points, but I actually had done a little bit of math on it and I thought about it a little harder. And, it is losing some stuff over the current version of the Wraithknight, like the -1 damage and stuff like that. So I decided to put it at 480. Again, I do think that the Wraithknight currently needs either a points drop of 30 points or some sort of new ability to, kind of make it worth it for the points cost it is now. I just didn't think that this ability alone would make it, greater than 500 points when you consider, some of the other models that exist in the game that are also Titanic, not being anywhere close and, basically having similar abilities as the Bombardier. So in conclusion, despite the Wraithknight being a decent unit in the right circumstances, some of its build options are extremely limited when it comes to viability, especially in ultra-competitive play. To fix the Wraithknight, I think GW really must look at expanding its datasheets as they have done with Crisis Battlesuits so that more people can have fun with different builds and not feel like they're pigeonholed into a single build or just not using it at all because it is no longer viable after the nerfs. And I think I'm actually going to play a few games with some of these variants and see what my opponents think about them, see if they're kind of balanced and stuff like that. A couple of my opponents, like for example, I have a buddy who plays Chaos Knights occasionally as, kind of a secondary army. I'm going to ask him to play a game with and see if, I can kind of go up against him with some of these different variants. And I think I'm actually going to play a few games with some of these variants and see what my opponents think about them, see if they're kind of balanced and stuff like that. A couple of my opponents, like for example, I have a buddy who plays Chaos Knights occasionally as, kind of a secondary army. I'm going to ask him to play a game with and see if, I can kind of go up against him with some of these different variants. to see what an actual Knight player, thinks about them. I do think they're pretty in line with a lot of what the Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights have as far as their unit diversity. So I think we're pretty good as far as that goes. But time will tell. We'll have to see, So also, if you want to let me know what your thoughts are on these variants, if they're, good enough, would this fix the issue of the Wraith Knight? Let me know in the comments section below. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thank you once again for watching, and thank you so much to my patrons and supporters for supporting the channel over the last almost 2 years now. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials on my Patreon activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the links for that in the description below. I also am an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page. So if you want to grab some discounted Eldar minis on Amazon or some Eldar-inspired apparel on the channel store page, I will leave those links in the descriptions as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to be back with more content very soon. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.